initially I was the U.S. correspondent. So it's just at least as much, if not more, a pleasure for me to be invited to speak to you. And I'll share some thoughts. And it's on the future of amateur radio. And my background, as you probably know, I'm a sociology professor who taught statistics, and my PhD is in both those areas. And I bring a little bit of that to the mix here in thinking about amateur radio. And I'm going to begin by saying that anytime you talk about the future of something, you have to realize, at the risk of sounding like that darn physicist who asked if his cat was dead or alive, well, you have to look in the box to find out. There are many futures. There's not just one future to amateur radio, because change is dynamic. And so any model that we might have of the future, knowledge of that model can change the outcome. Just like some of the models on the COVID-19 virus, we're changing those early estimates because we changed our behavior. So let's keep that in mind, because there's not just one future, and I don't pretend to know it. We can know the future by faith, and I have faith, but to know future by science, there are many futures, is kind of the punchline. Well, one of the ways to understand the future of amateur radio is we have to understand the organization of amateur radio. This organization of a technological hobby. It's not just the technology that guides our hobby. Our hobby is a social behavior. And unless you're calling CQ and answering yourself, you're communicating with at least one more person. And I'll get into a little bit of that. The punchline here is that technology doesn't exist in a vacuum. The technology changes us, and we change the technology. Just witness the personal computer revolution, and you heard things like user-friendly software. Software usability was a very key component and still is. But I spent many years being a beta test site for many pieces of software. And if you ever use the old word processing package called WordPerfect, I came very close to getting a big contract with the WordPerfect company out in Provo, Utah, to be their official test center. We decided to not go that route. As it turns out. But my point is that those who write code and those who engineer software have learned now to take the social condition into account. They've learned that by going out of business a few times, some of them. So let's think about that and keep that in mind. Well, how did we get where we are? What's the history of amateur radio? And without going way too much into it, basically the origins of amateur radio and radio itself, you know, that guy Marconi and others, was very organic. We didn't have an industry. We didn't have even government interest in this. We certainly didn't have a national society. So we grew that organically from people experimenting and thinking about this and coming up with ideas, from Marconi to Heaviside, and saying, hey, there's something called an ionosphere and a magnetosphere, and here's how it might work. Let's do some experiments and figure it out. So we grew that. And so it came from individuals experimenting and sharing info. But the original mode was CW, or Morse code. So early on, everybody thought very much alike. You were a ham, you communicated with CW. And now I don't know if you have these sort of arguments and fistfights over in the UK, but here in the States, you hear, what's the phrase I'm going to use? Real hams use CW. Why is that? Tradition. We have a lot of things that we believe in very strongly. I'll touch on that again in a moment, that come from that tradition. So think about the culture of amateur radio reflected that organic development of radio itself. And then when government figured they needed to get involved in it because we were messing up the ships at sea, at least here in the U.S., with our transmission, so we need to give bands. And so 200 meters and down, that very famous book about amateur radio, let's put them out. Let's put the dog out of the house. He's interfering with us. He's bothered. Let's put him out in the yard. Nobody wants to be in the yard. It's the dead of winter. Well, we got put there. And what did we do? Well, we built new, bigger, better, and faster ways to communicate. So today, we have a very diverse set of modes. And what's the big argument? Well, we went through when we got AM transmission. I don't know what in the UK you call those silly sidebanders, but here in the southern part of the U.S., the AMers, I remember it listening on an RCA floor model radio at my grandmother's house on AM, because that's all it would pick up. Those mush mouths talking like they have mush in their mouths. Why? Because if you didn't have a BFO, you couldn't understand the sideband transmission. So we had a scuffle over that. What's the scuffle over today? Those damned FT8 operators are on my frequency. Well, all that comes because we have the luxury of many modes, and yet that doesn't affect the technology per se, but it affects us. So the big point about this diversity that has come with our history of advancement is tolerance. Are we tolerant for change? Some of us are not. Many of us are not very tolerant for that. So if I were to ask you who are the real hams, some of you would probably say, well, I think it's CW. They started it all. Well, you know, I often tease another presenter on the podcast. He's on the alternate team now, Dan Romanchek. His nickname is the CW Geek. I'll say, well, you know, real hams are the experimenters because they made CW possible. And I'm doing that in fun. I'm doing that in great fun. But to point out, because of our history and our culture, we not you, not me necessarily, or Nick, or any one of you, but collectively we have groups of people who hold these feelings. So one of the things about the future of amateur radio is how much tolerance will we have collectively for embracing this diversity. You know, here in the States, the ARL is going through a new band plan. Nobody owns a frequency according to the FCC yet. We have an agreement that the bully bullpit of the National Society, ARL, has of saying, hey, nobody owns a frequency, but let's put repeaters here. Let's put CW here. Let's put phone there, so we don't conflict and compete over resources, because it is illegal to intentionally interfere with one another. So how much tolerance do we have for this diversity? Well, with that cultural shift, don't mind if I do. Well, with that cultural shift that's predicated on us getting better at our craft, and we are better. Let me briefly go through the organization of amateur radio, because we take that for granted very often. Number one, the government. Now, in the UK, you have a government agency that awards licenses and helps set down rules. Well, we do here in the US as well. There are national societies like the Rsgb and ARL and many others. There's the media, magazines, websites, YouTube, and podcasts. And I, for one, delighted that some of you listen to the podcast that I happen to be on. And there are clubs, and we'll come back to clubs. Now, you're in a club, and they tend to have various different foci. Some are DX clubs, some are repeater groups, some are generic ones. We do everything, and so on and so on. And then we have individuals who are in clubs, and I do not know the answer to this. I did some surveys for the 4 states in the Delta division of the ARRL, and only about 50% of those in our surveys in 2011 and 2013 had been in a club. Only about half. Nick, hold up your hands to me. About what percent is your guess on individual hams in clubs in the UK?
My guess it would be less than 50%. I think someone shout at me if I got this wrong amongst my guys here. 25-30% maybe.
Well, if you had to name one reason why more are not members of clubs, what would be the reason? Here, it's bad leadership. And I are one. I've been president of a club. I may be president of my club next year. But collectively, what our survey said came down to bad leadership. Nobody talked to me. Nobody welcomed me. Nobody invited me back. They didn't have good programs. I didn't want to listen to the minutes. I didn't want to sit and just eat and hear them talk about their experiences without an opportunity to talk, and so on. And that ultimately comes down, to leadership. So clubs are one of the niches, if you will, one of the layers. If you take an onion and peel this thing apart and have the government in the middle and you keep peeling these layers out, we're at that club level. And we have basically a weak connection for most societies in different countries. There's a weak connection at best between individual clubs and the national society. Now, I'm an assistant director for a division in the ARL. So that means I do flunky work for my division director who is elected. I'm appointed. I've been appointed by 2 different ones. And they can fire me anytime they want to. And if I say something they don't like, I've told them, fire me. I won't miss my salary. I'm doing it voluntarily. So I criticize ARL some. I suspect any one of you may differ with Rsgb. That's going to be par for the course to some degree. But at best, in the States, we have what I call the gold star relationship. If you fill this form out and you say you do these things, the ARL will recognize you and give you a gold star, and you can call yourself a certified club. Great. Now, they do a couple of other things. If you'll collect their money for them, they'll give you back some of it. So they give you a little finder's fee, and some clubs do that. So my club, if they get my money, I'm a life member, so I don't pay anymore. I paid what they asked for. But there is a little bit more than that, but not much more. So clubs are sort of out there. They're a little bit loose, but then there are some things to tie them there. Then you have individuals, and that two-step, that linkage between clubs, I want to harp on for just a minute. Now think about this in your club. I hear Martin and Chris Howard from our podcast team talk about their club, and I think Martin's the chair of it this time, and that kind of thing. And they'll talk about what the Rsgb's done or hasn't done or needs to do, and this kind of thing. There was work from World War I. My grandfather, whom I'm named for, was gassed with mustard gas in the Battle of Marne in France. During that period of time, a group of social scientists studied American soldiers and had a set of books called The American Soldier. And one of them, Paul Lazarsfeld, did a lot of research, and what he found still holds true today. It's important for us. He said, politically, individuals will take what's put out there by the national media, but there'll be opinion leaders locally that they filter all that information through. So there's this 2-step process. If the prime minister or the president does something and it's controversial, there'll be some local opinion leaders that individuals will filter that through. It may be folks at the pub. It may be someone at the church. It may be whomever. Now, do clubs do that for the national societies? Well, I think to some degree most clubs do. So sometimes clubs are going to participate or not, and that kind of thing. So clubs are really important for the future of amateur radio. I kind of want to make that point here. But they're not the only part. Those individuals, whether it's 50% to 75% who are not in those clubs, they may or may not pay dues to the National Society, and they're important. And they're an important part of the market for amateur radio. What do we say is one of our big challenges? Talked about the organization of amateur radio. What are some of the big challenges we face? Well, on this side of the pond, the holy grail is the people I see at rallies or hamfest or old graybeards like me. I'm 67, and I'm one of the younger hams. I mean, that's, so many are 60 and above here in the States, at least the ones we see at Hamfest, rallies, we see on websites with pictures and so on and so on. So how do we get young people involved? Well, a friend of mine, Don Keith, N4KC, frequent publisher, written about 30 books. Your neighbor, Gerard Butler, the actor, was the star in a film made from one of his recent books. And it was one of these submarine movies. I think it made Putin angry, which immediately made it a good film here in the West because it was about the Russian Navy. So Don Keith is a ham and a very active author. Hunter Killer is the name of the movie. He published a little piece on EHAM, and it was Fish Where the Fish Are. I live on the banks of a big lake here, and I used to fish. I don't have a boat and go out and fish a lot, but I know a fair amount about it. And fishermen all want to know the temperature of the lake at 15 feet below the surface at 4 in the morning. Why? That determines where the big fish are going to be that day. So are we looking for young people where they are? Well, I want to ask you something. There are gaming groups in the United Kingdom. I look at some of the magazines there, what are called electronic or e-sports. I want to ask you, if some teenagers came to you and said, hey, Nick, we want you to come play this game with us. It's cool. It'll keep your mind active. You won't go senile as fast. It'll be good for you. Come and sit in the back, and we'll tell you when to speak. And now you need to pay money. We want you to pay money because we have to have money to do this. So you come and you play this game, and we'll show you. And you won't be very good, but if you're nice to us, we'll teach you how to do this, and you can keep coming back. Now, how many of us would really do that? Well, unless it's your grandchild asking you or something like that, we'll do a lot of things for our grandchildren, right? I even put a pink wig on one time and had my photograph taken because my granddaughter wanted me to. But unless it's that, we're probably not going to do it. And to some degree, one of the interviews I did with Graham Brody, who started the Illinois Young Ham Club, he's telling us that's what you're asking us to do for the adult-driven amateur radio club. How did he find out about ham radio? Where young people find out about a lot of stuff on YouTube. He just stumbled into it. His dad said he thought he'd heard of ham radio before, but he didn't know anything about it. So if we put ourselves in the market that we want to attract shoes and in their mindset and listen to what they tell us, they don't want to sit at our knees and listen to how we built a crystal set with Litz wire and a Galena crystal. Now, if we laid those things out for them and mentioned you might be able to build a radio out of that and help them when they want to get that cat whisker to work, maybe. But they don't want to listen to you walk to school 8 miles in the snow, uphill both ways. They just don't want to do that. And sometimes we're guilty, I think, even though we don't mean to, we're guilty of wanting them to come to us. Now, another market that we say we need to do something about are women. We have women who are hams in the U.S. It's just not that many, and very often they tend not to be engaged. There are some exceptions, but they tend not to be in leadership, certainly as much as men. Well, in the United States, the Gallup survey organization, I've hired Gallup to do work for me when I was a professor and had a laboratory. They're one of the world's largest survey organizations and do very professional work. Their report for 2019 identified this, that in the United States, the public library is the most common cultural experience for children and adults, especially women. So where are young people and women at? Well, they're in schools, but they're also at the public library. Now, I wouldn't pretend to know how the schools are in the United Kingdom, although I've read a lot of research about them. But in the States, if you're someone who's an administrator, a principal or headmaster, and you have someone from outside the school, you know, someone who's an old geezer like me or you, hey, look, we want to come hang around your young people after school. Wow, I don't know much about you, sir. And we want a place, and we want to put a wire up, you know, lightning may strike it, but probably not, and so on and so on. You think about that headmaster. If he says or she says no, he's not going to get fired. If he says yes and something happens, he might get fired. Now, if you have a teacher inside who is an insider, have at it. Great thing. I've got a friend who I put a little money into it, and he has the Old Town Ham Radio Club at a junior high school here in Ridgeland, Mississippi. And he's actually done balloon launches and things, and they've just had a great time. But he's a teacher inside, and he has that trust. So I mean, you could go that route, but your level of success is not going to be very high. You will have some success, but it will not be very high. But an alternative, at least here in the States, is the public library. So the library and other places that are not at home or at work, home is the first place, at work is the second place, and all the other places are what a sociologist named Ray Oldham called third places. In the UK, a pub is the third place. It is a common cultural crossroad where you meet and greet people. Here in the United States, the company Walmart is said where you can see any and everybody, and they have these pictures of all kinds of crazy looking people in Walmart and what they wear and what they do. So where are we going to recruit from? Well, let's just listen and look at how we recruit and fish where the fish are. And remember that old U.S. bank robber said when he was arrested, "Why do you rob banks?" Because that's where the money is. So if we want to reach the market that we want to, then we need to think about ways that may be outside our comfort zone. If you have really nothing better to do and you look at my blog, there's a piece called Plant the Seed, Sow the Future. And here in the States, ARL has a set of 10 books. Their handbook, and then the antenna handbook, and then 8 others that they will sell shipped for $200 if they're going to libraries. And so along with my division director, I started the Plant the Seed initiative in the 4 states of the Delta Division. And I don't know if Rsgb has something like that. It's just an incentive. But getting those books in libraries is important. But the second thing that it does, see, public libraries tend to want people who know about stuff to come to the library. It may be knitting. I know Martin's wife, Carol, is into crafts, and they used to have a podcast, on crafts. And so you've got all kinds of crafts workshops at the library. They want these kinds of things because they need a constituency. So in donating books on amateur radio to the library, what you do is you begin to set up a relationship with the director of that library where you can come talk about amateur radio and do what Don Keith in 4KC says, you're fishing where the fish are. So clubs have the bandwidth and the flexibility. There's a good side to clubs having that freedom. Some groups in hobbies are just local chapters of their national society. And that national society really dictates how they operate. And there's some benefits for that. But there's also less freedom to kind of do what you want to do. So that loose organization that I talked about was not necessarily, a criticism. So thinking about where we're going to find our market to replace ourselves as we age, I want to focus on that for just a moment. Nick, I assume aging is viewed as a problem in the United Kingdom. Is that a fair statement?
I would say so, yes.
Well, and so we're worried about our market share may go away and that kind of thing. Well, I want to give you some good news. if we look at what people say they do by their age, and we organize that by age, that's what we egghead types in social sciences called a life course. You know, you typically, in some places by law, you must enter school at a certain age or by a certain age. You typically complete some level of schooling, and you may continue on, you may not. And you can look at what's the typical age for entry in the workforce, or perhaps getting married if you do, perhaps having a child if you do, and so on and so on. So if you take a little chart and organize it and say, all right, let's ask people what they do, how they spend their time, here's what you're going to find. In the U.S. at least, when someone becomes licensed as a ham, has an indelible impression on them. Now, I was what I call a late in life ham. I began listening at 8 years of age on that old RCA shortwave receiver in my grandmother's living room. Had the green winking eye. When you tuned it in real tight, I would wink at you. But I had no Elmer. There was only one other ham that I was ever aware of in my county who was a ham radio operator. Didn't know I was in poverty, but technically I was. So I went on about my life, still keeping an interest in amateur radio. I read QST. I listened. I was a broadcast band DXer. I was a shortwave listener, and I did all of that. I just didn't get licensed. And went on, was in the news business, built some radio stations, went to graduate school, became a professor. And next thing you know, I'm at the later phases of my life. I retire as a professor, and I go work for the college board, who they are over the university system in my home state of Georgia. So I'm working in Atlanta, and I see this note at Georgia Tech, wonderful university in Atlanta. They're having a ham radio boot camp. Get your first license in a weekend, no code required. And because I was writing books and doing grant proposals, doing research, and doing all the things the professor has to do, I just never felt like I had time to learn Morse code, so I never got licensed. So I got licensed 50 years later at age 58. Later, I found out that at least in the Delta Division, that is the fastest growing segment in amateur radio, is the late in life. I'm going to come back to it. But if we look at that life course trajectory, you know what's wrong with ham radio? Nothing, except everything besides ham radio tends to take priority. Amateur radio is a hobby, just like flying a plane, stamp collecting, doing other things. It's part of sport and leisure activities. And when you look at the average amount of time for sport and leisure activities, it's high when you're a young person, it goes down, and then later it comes back up. It comes back up when the kids are out of the house, it's your peak earning potential, and you got time. 3 magic ingredients that makes ICOM, Kenwood, and Yaesu happy. Because people they spend more money because they got more money that they can turn loose of. And you know, the biggest competitor to amateur radio in the U.S., in that leisure time, it's an average of 5 hours a week spent in leisure time. 3 of those 5 hours are doing what? Watching the telly. So if we wanted to point a finger at one competing activity, I'm guilty. My wife and I, since we retired, I love watching certain TV shows with her. And that's part of how we spend time together. And we both enjoy it. It's competition from television. So when we think about what else is going on, and you say, we don't have that 35-year-old energetic hotshot who wants to come in and rejuvenate our club as president or whatever. Well, why not? Well, may have 2 little ones at home, may have other things, may have to get a second job depending on the economy. And, you know, there's just a lot of competing things that go into that. We tend to think, what are we doing wrong? Well, we may not be doing anything wrong. It's just that competition for things that, if we were honest, really are more important than a hobby. You know, that's not a popular thing to say, but as I said, the ARL can fire me if they disagree too much. So I'll share this with you if you don't buy that argument. In the Great Depression in the United States, in 1929 and on, one of the famous studies was of children in the Great Depression. They grew up being very frugal. Some would say cheap. They would save milk cartons. They'd turn every light off. They didn't want to waste electricity, because when you were a child in the Depression, that made an impact on you. If you were an adult, you got over it. So aren't we a little like that by when, if we got licensed and we were young, the way ham radio was done then, that's the way it ought to be done? Well, not so to young people. They didn't experience that. Now, how do we deal with some of these things that I've pointed out? There are some of the social organization, and I'm not pointing at individuals. That's about our social fabric. It's not about our individuals. Well, how do we learn what we think we know about amateur radio? Well, for the most part, in the U.S., we use what I call our personal windshield. Now, by that, if you imagine driving the car, you see something through the windshield of your car, and that's what you see. Hey, honey, how was it today going to work? Oh, not much traffic. Well, really, that traffic helicopter, Martin Rothwell does some traffic for the BBC sometimes. That traffic helicopter is up there and getting a whole different view than you got through your personal windshield. Well, if we only believe that amateur radio is as we see it when we go to the various rallies or at our clubs, then we are being siloed. No wonder we look very gray, because that's all we see. Well, does Rsgb collect systematic data on hams in the UK? I've been a member 7 or 8 years, but I don't know. Do they? Do they do surveys of hams?
I haven't seen one for many, many years, Frank, at least 20 odd years.
Well, if you contact a company, they won't charge you a fair amount of money. I think my division director was shocked. I built 2 survey centers at Mississippi State University and done national surveys and local surveys and taught survey research. So I've been there and done that. It's kind of one of the things I did. When I told Dave Norris that the report I did in 2011 for him, he asked me, he's a highway engineer. He said, what does that usually cost? I said, well, for my part alone, about $10,000 was what I would charge. And then the cost. And he was shocked. And I said, well, David, it's like good cement. If you want a good road, you will pay for high quality cement, right? I said, surveys aren't much different. I said, on the other hand, aren't you fortunate that you stumbled into somebody whose career happened to have that expertise? And if the ARL would learn more about what their membership does, you've got more people than me who know how to do this. And I would suspect that the membership of Rsgb has a lot of talent that if they would bring them in, like me, would do it for free. That substantially reduces the cost. So a couple of things that I'll say here. I wrote a proposal for my division director. It got approved at the board. It went to the administration and finance committee, which is how they really decide what they're going to spend money on. And it was approved and going to be reported back out at our June board meeting. And I'm told by Dave Norris that it will be approved. And we'll have a research working group. And they wouldn't dare let a peon like me be in charge of it. So I'll be a volunteer flunky who'll do all the work. And I'm happy to do it. I'm sort of tongue-in-cheek here, making fun. But what I want to do is start a biannual survey that starts with our FCC database, and we do a rigorous sample design, which I will design, so we can give good estimates for each of our divisions. And we do that every 2 years. But that middle year, we follow up with them and get them to go to a website to do another follow-up survey. And let me tell you what that can give you. And it can be done, I think, easier in the UK, but we can talk about that. You get the change. How much has age changed? Just that one number, a good median age. a licensed ham for a country that you can trust, like measuring your temperature, if you can trust it that much, what's a good meal? We don't have that. I mean, it's astounding that we don't have that. Well, in the U.S., the FCC dropped birth date from their intake form. They dropped gender and racial ethnicity. Well, gee, how do we know who we're recruiting? You know, so I'm going to try to work on that through my senator. Senator Wicker in Mississippi is on a chair of a subcommittee that gives oversight to the FCC. And I'm going to try to do a little backdoor politic and see if we can't get that. And that was just a decision with somebody at a computer says, they don't use that, so let's kick it out. You know, it's still in the data table. They just don't have any numbers. Now, so we can do year 1, year 3. We do a follow-up in year 2, then we get change on the individual level. And we can measure all sorts of cool things. So with a sample, say in the United States of about 5,000, I'd like to get that implemented. One of the things I've done, and I'm ignorant about the United Kingdom, is I've got the FCC database of all hams each January back to 2000. And I taught GIS and pioneered that a bit in my career from the early 80s. So I've got them all geocoded. I can put points on maps. And those that have postal addresses, yeah, that's not where they live, but there's only about 2% of those actually in the U.S. data. So it's not bad. It's not perfect, but it's not bad. So I'm going to begin to look at how they've moved, where the growth has been, where's been the decline. And I'm just doing that for free because I've done it for a long time. It's just kind of fun. You know, I'm giving free labor and happy to do it. So here's my punchline to you as a club. Push for a research working group in the Rsgb. Clearly, they should know about members and about all hams. I haven't checked their mission statement, but the ARL has in its mission statement, which is how this little research working group got approved, because I put their feet to the fire. You say you're supposed to know about this, but you don't collect any data that you make public. They do collect some, they don't make it public. Push the Rsgb to do something. Volunteer, find people who have some expertise, like me, and who are willing. Heck, at the risk of being crazy, I'll lend any expertise I can to help you because it should be done. Now, do you have an open database of all the ham licenses in the UK? Is that something that's open to the public?
It is, yeah. So we've got a complete database of every single current license. People can.
Do they have an address of where they are?
It's got their address of where they are. People can withhold their addresses, but most people don't.
Well, Nick, I tell you what I'll do. If you can be so kind as to get that database for a given year, I mean, whatever slice you get, I'll give a go at geocoding it, give it back to you. You can put it on Google Maps or anything, or I'll make a map or two for you. And here's one of the things I've done for some clubs. The Atlanta area where I got licensed, and I was a member of the Atlanta Radio Club for a number of years. And we were originally going to retire over in that area, but we wound up moving back here because my mother-in-law was an Alzheimer's patient, and my son was a golf pro here at the local country club. We've since lost my mother-in-law. She's passed on, and my son is over as a coach at University of Alabama with their golf team. And so we were going to retire in Georgia, but so far we haven't. Built a house here, and you know how it goes. So I took their membership and I plotted it on a map, and then I put all the hams they're missing. I did a trajectory around all the clubs. Here's where your draw area is from. Where are you getting your members from? Hey, you got one in Italy. You know, and so there'll be funny kinds of things that pop out of that. But looking at it, and I've done that for free, and I give it back to clubs. And here's a spreadsheet with the people who otherwise you'd be the closest club, but they're not a member. Reach out to them. I will do that for you. If you'll get me your national database, I'll geocode it. If you would be willing for me to get your call signs of your members, I'll then give it back to you with a map of who's close to you and just give you a sense of that. But that R&D work is something we need to do. and if you don't push for it, um, you know, we're all guilty of this. If you work at headquarters, it's a job. It becomes less of a hobby. The people that work at ARL every day, some of them don't want to do ham radio when they get home. They're tired of hearing about ham radio, and their spouses are damn tired of hearing about ham radio because that's work. So sometimes, you know, it's about, yeah, okay, well, nobody's yelling about that. Well, we'll do that later. That sounds good. We'll do it later. You got to push. You know, there's ways of being polite and all that good stuff, but, you know, squeaky wheel, oil, and those kind of things. So, and if they don't want to do it, you know, you've got people like Don Field and George and others at the other alternate magazines. Let's continue to talk, because there are ways of doing some of those surveys using SurveyMonkey and some other online. All you got to do is get a good sample, but the sample is very important. Otherwise, your personal windshields are probably as inaccurate as them. So I really encourage you to consider that. If you want to make a difference, that's important to do. So I want to end with this, and then we can talk about questions. You might think, hey, this guy is just kind of giving us some doom and gloom here. No, I'm not. The future of amateur radio will depend on whether we old geezers are willing to tolerate change and make room for new blood by understanding them and making a place for them and letting them drive their own ship to some degree. Have a sister youth club. Help them get started. Be there, you know, if they fall off the bicycle, put the training wheels on the bicycle, but let them drive the cart. They're going to love it much more. And if they don't stick around with ham radio, here's what's going to happen. When they get to mid-career, and they got an empty nest, and they got a couple of pounds, some of them will come back to ham radio. I did, and many others have too. But the next thing is this, is that we're in a renaissance period for building. You know, our friend Hans Summers, I've been involved in building this Homebrew Hero Award program, and Hans is our first winner. And Martin and Colin Butler and I kind of are the steering committee for it. We have an anonymous selection committee. And I told the selection committee, hey, it's the easiest year you'll ever have because anybody can be a good candidate. As we go down the line, it will get much more difficult. And Hans, I was delighted when that name came forward. He is a prototype of someone who moved out of the regular world of work, built his own little company, QRP Labs. He left the financial district making pretty good money, and he's selling enough of these kits and writing some of the best documentation. I mean, look, ICOM, Yaesu, and Kenwood could hire Hans and improve their manuals alone. He writes really, really good documentation, and he's making a living. He's got another mouth to feed by now. His wife's expecting, so just to have that. But that's an example. Asher Foreign in India. I mean, there's just a lot of people, and you have many in your country who write about building things with cheap electronics, and we're really in a period for that and the maker movement. The maker movement being led by younger people. Can we attract them to use radio in the maker space? Many of them already are with what we call Part 15 in the U.S. That is, you don't have to have a license because you're not using enough power in a certain frequency. So I think there's a natural chemistry to do that. And if you think back, I know I can speak for myself. They just want us to treat them like we wanted to be treated when we were their age. We didn't want the old guard telling us how to do stuff for fun, did we? That's how Radio Caroline came into being, wasn't it? We weren't going to let the government tell us we couldn't listen to rock and roll music. So we had our Alan Weiner, who now has WBCQ, and he has a legit license. So I'll end with that. Put the pieces out there, lead them to ham radio, and get the hell out of their way, and just make sure you're there when they need you, because they will. let them develop their own and marvel at what they do, and they'll teach you a couple of things, I'm sure, if we're just willing to listen. So I'll end with that. I'll take a sip or two, and I hope some of this has been meaningful, and I'll be glad to chat about it with anyone.
All right, brilliant. Thank you, Frank. That was very interesting. Lots of ideas you chucked about there for us. And incidentally, we've got Don Field speaking at one of these meetings in a few weeks' time. So I've made a note. I've made a note to myself. I'm going to see if I can entice him into your concept of the research working group.
Well, I will share this with you. Another idea I've got is something called a portable operations challenge, where, my son's the golfer, I'm not, but we're using the golf handicap concept to maybe not completely equal, but equalize portable operations and traditional contest stations. And since we've been talking, Don Field's email to me agreeing to be on the steering committee just popped up. So he at least knows who I am. And he seems to be a good guy, and I love his magazine. I retired from Springer Media in the Netherlands after I left the board as editor-in-chief in my area of science. So I've been on that side of the desk, and it's a challenging job. But he and George both seem like they do a good job. I subscribe to both magazines and love it. So I'm sure he'll do a great job as a speaker.
Okay, the first one I've got to speak is David, M0RIU. I've unmuted you, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Thanks, Frank. That was really interesting. You can tell you can come from a background of statistics, and that's where your interest lays.
Right.
Regarding the handicapping system, there is a set of contests, and I think it's the Rsgb that do them, where you score different points dependent on your license class. So
Right.
If you're a foundation licensee, you score perhaps 5 times as many points as the full licensee, and if you're an intermediate, you score twice as many.
Great. Thank you for pointing that out to me. I will check that. We're kind of in the building stage and just trying to get it sort of right to begin with the ability to tune it a little bit there. So thank you for that.
They'd have to be careful with it, because there are some people that have 3 licenses that haven't surrendered their earlier stages. So you have Technician Extra and whatever. You have a 3-tier system as well, don't you? But
Right.
I've still got my first level license, but I've got what I think is now a significant station, and I could compete using my first level license with my significant station now and score high points. So you just have
I'm going to make a note. Participants must be ethical.
Yeah. Good luck.
Okay, thanks, David. Good point. Right, who else wants to come into this debate? Got any questions? Yeah, Richard, I'll just unmute you.
Unmute. Yeah, good evening, Frank, and thank you for a most interesting chat. I just wanted to confirm, I was a shortwave listener up to being about 23, 24-year-old. I'm 77 now, and I left the hobby for 41 years. And exactly like you described, when I retired when I was 62, which was 15 years ago, I returned to the hobby, had to take the 3 licenses that we have here in the UK, and came back to it just as you explained, going, starting here, dipping out and coming back again. So what you say is very, very true. And just to finish off, today I started reading Johnny Walker, who was a disc jockey on one of the Radio Caroline ships. I've just started reading his autobiography.
Listen, there were such exciting times, wasn't it? And it was wonderful.
Yeah, I was sat in the garden or in the yard. It was lovely and sunny. I've got the Eagles playing on a little portable radio, well, on my phone actually. And Shirley, my wife, and I were sat out, and I was reading about Caroline, and all of a sudden we were back in the 1960s. Yeah. Most exciting times, and I don't think they'll ever be as exciting again.
Well, they were certainly exciting, wonderful, and the fact that we had a historic sunspot cycle didn't hurt. because you could hear things, and you are exactly right. There's several books about that era that are just, when I start reading them, I can't put them down. So I appreciate your telling me that. I will, at the risk of crass self-promotion, I did have a feature of this on the current podcast with Thomas Witherspoon, K4SWL, who runs the swelling.com blog about shortwave listening and its attraction to hams. If you have time, you might give a listen to the current episode of the ICQ podcast. It starts at about an hour, 27 minutes into it. So you might find that a little bit interesting. We talk about number stations, which are the spy stations, and some of those things that some hams are not aware of. But thank you for your memory and sharing that, Richard.
Yeah, and I've just got a question before you finish. Here in the UK, a lot of operators my age and above have a distinct intolerance to the newcomers coming into the hobby. And I wonder if you have that in the States. They joke about you can get a license on the back of a Kellogg's cornflake packet and things like that. And we don't have to draw graphs anymore. We have to three questions for each, three answers for each question. Cool. And you've still got to know the subject, but some of the older ones particularly are very intolerant of this. And I wonder if you've got the same in the States.
I've certainly observed it, and I'll share a couple of things with you. If you ever look at eham.net, my friend Dick Bentley manages a little spot in the upper right-hand corner where they're just little odd sayings that people put out there called strays. And he's in the Atlanta Radio Club, and that's how I knew him. He emailed me and said, Frank, send me something. I don't have anything new. So I sent him one that said, real hams are ... those with a valid license. Instead of real hams use Morse code. Do you know I literally got a piece of hate email threatening me, a guy who is a falconer in North Carolina. He threatened to attack me. And I thought, well, there is a good example of that lack of tolerance. Point number 2, if you ever see Ham Nation, my neighbor, George Thomas, W5JDX, he lives only about 3 miles from me. He was in broadcasting as I was earlier, but he stayed in broadcasting. And he had first class FCC broadcast license as opposed to ham license. He got his ham license later after the Morse code was acquired. And do you know that the Jackson Amateur Radio Club ran him off because he was a no-code tech? Well, it's interesting because I've said this, and he won one of the Dayton Hamvention Awards a few years ago, and we gave him a nice dinner. He's probably the most well-recognized ham in the entire state because of his being on Ham Nation and with Amateur Logic TV. And so they ran off somebody who became a lot more well-known than they'll ever be as a club, And so it's a shame, Richard, that intolerance is there, but over whether you got tested on CW or not is a great cultural divide. And it's very strong here in the States, too. I'm sorry to learn it's there in the UK, but yes, indeed, it is. And that was part of what I meant by if we want the hobby to grow and survive and replace ourselves, then we've got to learn how to deal with this collective intolerance. See, it doesn't take everybody being intolerant for the group to be intolerant. It just takes a few people.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. And what we're doing tonight with Zoom is that step forward into new technology. Who would have thought back at Christmas time that our club meetings in Denby Dale, we'd all be sat here chatting to other like we are. And I think it's wonderful that we brought you in from the States, from another continent, and I hope it will continue. And we'd love to see you again, I'm sure, on this meeting. So thanks very much indeed from me.
Well, thank you for the kind remarks, and it's at least as much, if not greater, pleasure for me because I get to meet you. And one of these days, I'll make it across the pond, and maybe I can come visit in person. I would love to do that. But I'll be happy to come back again. As my usual joke is, if you can't get a good speaker, I might be available.
Well, one question, Frank. Do you think you could get us Joe Walsh on here? Now, that would be wonderful.
Well, I will tell you, Bob Howell, I don't know if you know the story about Joe Walsh. Joe Walsh, and he will tell you this, too much in alcohol and drugs, as many rock and roll stars were. But Bob Howell was doing the sound equipment for the Eagles, for the James Gang, which was the group that he was a member of before the Eagles, as well as ZZ Top and The Who and just a lot of them, the Grateful Dead. And he got to know Joe. And really, Bob Howell and his wife got Joe Walsh clean and sober. And he will tell you, Bob Howell saved my life. So he and Bob are like that. Don't tell anybody but just us girls. I've done some favors for Bob Howell. I said, Bob, I want an interview for Joe Walsh for the ICQ podcast. I said, that's how you're going to repay me, because I've done a lot of PR work for Bob. And I hope I can get an interview with Joe Walsh. But as you can imagine, he has a lot of requests for his time. But I'm working on it, Richard. I'm working on at least getting him for an interview. That'd be wonderful, wouldn't it?
Mm-hmm. I think Bob Howell's got some sort of a Zoom meeting, hasn't he, where I know I spoke to him a couple of years back, so we'll take that up. Right, enough from me. Back to you, Nick.
Thank you, Richard. Well, who else wants to dive into this debate? Look, there's been, I don't know if you followed it at all, Frank, there's a Zoom group chat and lots and lots of comments. I'm going to save them all as well. Sorry, David, because there's some very interesting contributions people are making.
Well, Nick, here's what I will do. I will email you my little notes. I've got some bullet points that I covered. I'll email that to you if that would be useful. Be happy to do that.
Okay, that's great. Right, who else wants to? I've got some comments, but I want to chuck it over to other people. Gerald, did you want to?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you. Just thank you to Frank. It was really great listening to you. It's a lot of the thoughts that you've come up with, some that we've been thinking out many times before. We tried to get into some of the local schools and things like that. Not tried the libraries. I've made a note of that on my piece of paper, so we'll have to try libraries next, I think. But yeah, thank you, Frank. Lots of ideas there. I think I'm going to be working on these for at least another 20 years. Back to you, Nick.
Well, so is my friend Martin Jew of MFJ Enterprises. He taught when he was a professor at Mississippi State. He taught in the building next to me, literally next door. We all have ideas for products, and everybody buttonholes him at a rally and says, "Hey, you need to build so and so." And he says, "Frank, there are a lot of great ideas for products. A few of them might make money." So there are a lot of ideas out there, but some of them might prove to be good. And I wish you well with the libraries. I do think that's something worthwhile, because you just don't know when the seed for the hobby will be planted by that student who's bored or whatever and runs across that book. It happens in lots of different areas. So it's worth a try.
Okay, thank you, Gerald. Right, who else wants to contribute? Any other questions or points?
Can I ask Frank something? Frank, I've got an American call sign. I did it last year just for a bit of fun.
Yeah. And
it's November 2 Mike Radio Texas. I did both of them. I did one in Leeds about 1980s, the Technician. And then last year, Ripon Amateur Radio Club is one of 5 centres outside the States that take them. And I did the advanced and the extra. And I've never been to the States. But I I don't know why I did it, but what you were saying was that the hobby, it keeps old brains turning over. And you hear on the news in England so many times that old people get lonely and they don't know who to talk to. And the way society's going around England, in what society is in London, where next door neighbours, they may have lived next door to each other for 20 years and they don't know who they are.
Right.
You know, and I think amateur radio is something that older people should take up just to keep themselves active and relieve boredom.
You know, on your point, and I'm going to use you. I'm going to make a joke to my wife. I'm going to tell my wife, I put at least one of them to sleep because when he asked me a question, he was already in bed with the pillows behind him. That's a joke.
No,
I'm going to use your idea here because, you know, we have what are called recreation centers. I have one next door to where I live. And there are a lot of people who are retired, they're elderly, and they go there for exercise, for coffee, for whatever. And you've got an audience to where they want to learn things. So if you have recreation halls and things in the UK, that may be something in addition to the library that might be a third place. And finding people, because the public, rank and file, has this idea that we're just a bunch of weird people that would mess up their TV, you know, that image. And so learning about what amateur radio is kind of really about and what opportunities that it has. And it's a social gathering. We have a ham, his name's Jim Martin, K0 UPW. He retired here from the state of Washington. He had lived here in Jackson, Mississippi, 40 years ago. I think his wife, who passed away, is originally from here. Well, he came for a visit and visited our club. And his brother-in-law still lives back out in Washington. Well, Jim is retired here. He's active. And he is listening to our repeater from 8 in the morning till 11 at night. He posts things on our Facebook page several times a day. And he's doing it because it's a social activity for him. And as he's learning to meet people through our club, you know, he's beginning to get integrated into the local community. But it's the ham radio operators that are his kind of first social group that he's connected with. And it's right. And for clubs, that's great to have people that have time. What's the big thing that we say about repeaters? There's nobody on them. You know, in the States, every club that's, you know, we've got to have our own repeater, but then nobody talks on it. Well, they're busy and they've got cell phones. So having people have meetings, we have a noonday net that sprang up after the coronavirus, and it's just to check on one another. And I think there are 20 to 25 people who are on that net. Now, if you tried to start a net, getting 25 people meeting on it regularly would be a chore. But because there's the need that you're talking about, boom, they're there, you know, every day, Monday through Friday, and they're doing it. So I think your point's well taken, and I'm going to make a note about recreation centers as really another venue for that.
Excellent. Yeah, the problem is with amateur radio these days. When I was young, which I still try to be, what we did at school was totally different to what schools do at the present day.
Right.
Whereas we had metalwork classes, we had woodwork classes, we did science, we did mathematics. I mean, when I was 14 and 15, we did differentiation, integration. And at 16, we did volumes of revolution. And all this down, it's been dumbed down. And they don't do that level of education till people are at university.
Right.
You see. And everything's changed instead of manufacturing. But I mean, when I did my degree, we had machines, electrical machines, and a high voltage lab. All that has been demolished, and now it's as small as you can get. I remember one of the lecturers in the 70s saying that miniaturization is the big thing, but it's an amateur radio is going like that these days.
Yeah.
Whereas if you want to do something with a transceiver, your test equipment costs about 5 times as much as the transceiver itself.
Right.
And if it goes, you can't do anything. Whereas years ago, you got a transceiver, oh, blimey, the bottle's gone. So you just change the new bottle. Or something else has gone, a resistor's burnt out. But you can't do that with modern stuff. Because
with modern stuff, you have a pepper mill of resistors that you can just put, because they're about the size of a peppercorn.
That's right, yeah. Surface mounted stuff.
Well, I will tell you this on the workbench. I spent the last 2 years kind of putting together a workbench. And I will say this, there's two effects of the cheap stuff from the Pacific Rim, mostly China, but not totally. It has made the price of the Hewlett Packard and Tektronix professional gear plummet. And so I've got a number of items, and I totaled it up. And then I've got some newer stuff. I've got a 4-channel Regal scope. I've got a Siglent spectrum analyzer. I've got a Tech spectrum, and that kind of thing. Well, if you total up everything, and if I bought it, as they say, when you buy a car right off the parking lot, it would be a $250,000 lab, which I couldn't afford. But I may have $5,000 in it, US dollars, for what would have been a $250,000 lab. So I agree with your point. Your point's well taken. One of the nice things about the era that we're in is that there is such a market for the used equipment that was built, as they say, like a tank. The big problem is keeping it running. So if you buy, an HP signal generator, you need to get 2 of that model, 1 for parts. But it's an interesting time. I'm one of the articles I'll get around to writing is learning about amateur radio by looking through catalogs and advertising for old equipment. And you go through time and you see how the different companies, when the first hybrid Riggs and Kenwood and Trio came in, where the tubes were transmit, receive was transistorized. And you can learn a lot about the history of ham radio by simply looking at the equipment. And you raise a number of those issues. So I appreciate your comment.
There's a good website on YouTube, Mr. Carson's Lab. Have you seen it?
Outstanding. Paul Carlson is outstanding. I'm close to, he's got to pay. Well, you have to make a donation, and it's the free stuff. Now he's got one. You make a Patreon. I'm about to do the Patreon. He is very, very good. I love his stuff.
I'm sorry. I have to.
David, yeah.
I have to disagree with Railway Richard. I've got to call you that, Richard, so I can differentiate between you and Radio Richard, the other guy. Education has not been dumbed down. I've been through GCE and CSEs, GCSEs, A levels, a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and I'm currently studying to a PhD. My daughter is currently doing A levels. The things that she was doing at GCSE are what I was covering at A level. So education has not been dumbed down. Quite the inverse is true. And one of your other comments, Richard, about, it's exactly what Frank's been talking about during the whole speech, about amateurs saying, when we did it in our way, we used to do this, and when we did it our way, we used to do that. We used to swap the bottle over. We've moved on from that, and it's like the no-code hams. People are still embracing code. Radio Richard didn't need to do code to get his license. He's picked it up and he's done it. I didn't need to do it to do my license. I've picked it up and I've done it badly, but I've done it. it's still attracting people. When the attitude of we used to do it like this, why can't we still do it like that, is exactly what Frank's talking about. That's it.
Yeah, it comes down to money as well, doesn't it, David? You know, if you want to spend £5,000 on a rig, fair enough, but a lot of people can't afford it.
You don't need to spend £5,000 on a rig. You don't need to spend £5,000 on a rig. Entry-level rigs now are cheaper than they have ever been. If you look at what an entry-level rig would cost you now, something like a 7300 or a 590. I'm trying to think of Yesu's entry one. Yesu's is the 991, I think, is it? Their entry-level rigs now are sub £1,000, and look at what Gerald, who's I think he's the most experienced guy here, what an entry-level rig would have cost. Not a converted War Department piece of kit. I'm on about a purchased entry rig, brand new, out of the showroom. What would that have cost in today's money? It's cheaper now than it's ever been.
It was about 6 months' salary to get a rig in those.
There you go. A minimum wage now is over £1,000 a month.
Mm-hmm.
Well, guys, you make a good point. Let me share this with you. And I'm not able to share the paper with you because it'll be owned by the National Contesting Journal. I've got a 2-part paper that'll be published by the ARL, then the National Contesting Journal, on aging and contesting, and it will share some of this. It'll come out in June. Once it's out, I can make it available. A second paper that I have speaks directly to what you're talking about. You're all familiar with Robert Sherwood and his tables and evaluating the received parts. Well, I've been communicating with Rob. I've taken his entire table, and now he likes to sort things on the dynamic range. But why? He's a CW contester, and that's the single most important measurement for a CW contester, is the narrow dynamic range. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't apply to everyone. So what I've done is, statistically, I've taken all of his measurements and put them together into one index. And I've taken the price when the rig was introduced to the market. Took me about 2 months, and I researched that, even going back to some of the old magazines, their first price listed. And then I took the EHAM ratings of consumer satisfaction, and I've looked at them, the bang for the buck, that is the Sherwood evaluation for the buck. And when you look at the Sherwood index over time, and he's a little shocked by this. I'm going back and forth with him a little bit. I'm not sure he's quite bought it, but what you just said, that trend since 2000, we're getting the best receivers we've ever gotten, and it's not even close. And when you look at the performance for the retail price, you'll be surprised at which company's rigs come out at the top clearly. Some won't be happy, some will be ecstatic, but I didn't make the data up. I'm just using. Now that one, I'm going to send it to QST. I don't know if they'll take it or not. We'll see. At some point, I'll be willing to share that with you. But your point, I can underscore without documenting it yet. Your point is absolutely spot on. We're in a period of, since 2000, but especially 2010, of having the best rigs. Might need to tweak the transmission some, as Rob Sherwood has said in QST, but the receive capability is the best it's ever been. You have to trust me for a few months, but I'll have the results for you.
Now that will be interesting. Right, we've got a few other people, so before we close, anyone who hasn't asked a question or made a point wants to dive. Hang on, Richard. Hang on.
Can I ask Frank one question? Not to do with radio. Tell me, Bushcraft shut down over at Mississippi.
Well, now you dropped out. Repeat that.
Yeah. As Cushcraft closed down and all
No.
because of this coronavirus. Because I've been trying to ring them today.
Well, what they are doing, and I meet with Martin every 3 months, and for some reason he likes to ask me questions, and so, well, I've known him for a long time. They've redone their website, and one of the things that they've not yet done is get all the little parts, all the pictures of the little parts that you can buy, because he's got about 3,000 things to sell. And getting the parts on, he's got a tremendous set of parts. You want a butterfly capacitor? He makes them. Not many places make them anymore. So they're still updating, and Cushcraft and the MFJ part, they're still putting the parts on. So if their website is down for a day, don't worry about it. It's just updating that. They've redesigned it and updating it, and it's all being tied into, if you've got a customer ticket, you got a problem with something, when they're getting low on parts inventory, it'll set off an alarm, buy more of this. So he's kind of modernized it a bit, but it's been up and down lately. But no, they've not shut down.
I only asked that because I rang Watson at Southampton today, and I said, "Are you still communicating with Cushcraft?" And he said, "No, the whole is closed because of this coronavirus. That's all."
Well, I'm not sure if that's true, because Richard Stubbs is one of the staff members, and I communicate with Richard every couple of days, and he's there at the office. And I mean, they may be slower getting things out because they may have a problem getting things in, getting parts in. They are really not shut down. Now, that supplier may not be happy because they're not getting shipments in like they want, but the way business is, if you've been buying 10,000 a month and the other one's buying 2,000, who you think's going to get preference? I mean, that's the way it is. So that vendor that you talk to just may not be able to get their shipment. And I will tell you, there are some, I won't name the company, but there'll be salespeople and resellers, and they get a bee in their bonnet and their knickers in the wad about a company, and they'll tell. Ask me if Martin used prison labor to build his stuff. That one of your major vendors, told him that Martin used prison labor, and I can guarantee you that's simply not true. So don't believe everything that you hear. So,
all right, thanks. I'll try again tomorrow.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Right, before we finish tonight, anyone else got a last question they want to put to Frank? Yeah, Ray, go ahead. Let me just unmute you and that's it.
Right,
Okay.
am I on? Yeah. Hi, Frank.
hey.
I actually live on the other side of the Pennines to these, so I'm quite unpopular with these people. But over here, our local club, it closed down several weeks ago with the COVID-19, and they've been running club nets just on 2 meters, usual thing, but they've been using Zoom for the pictures. And the net I was on Monday evening, we had 4 young people on in the 20s, and it was about 25% of the people on were in the 20s. And I think this sort of technology, it gives them something, they quite like it. And we also had a couple of people who were working through the license at present, but they haven't got the license, but they could listen to the net through Zoom. So that was all I wanted to say. I think using new ideas and not having to go up people because they use FT8 or the digital modes, I think it's a good idea to embrace this. And like you said, everybody's got the license, and we should welcome them in, and that's about it.
Well, listen, thank you for your comments. I see your binocular over there behind you. Are you a bird spotter?
Yeah, it's trained straight onto the bird table.
Oh, good. I used to have a big telescope. Enjoyed watching. Let me tell you that Bob Howell and Gordon West began doing presentations remotely by Skype about 7 years ago. because I had them. I was in Starkville, where MFJ was, where I was had lived, and I was president of the club there, and I got them, to give presentations. And I will tell you, I've got a proposal to the American Radio Relay League that they try to lead on getting this, and some of the so-called stars, the popular names, people who have expertise in a certain thing, whether it be Joe Taylor. Now, Joe wouldn't do it. He guards his time, but experts on FT8 or whatever the topic is, when you think about it, they could do 2 or 3 presentations to clubs around the world. They've got internet, they could do it. And they could do it almost off the top of their head if that's their expertise. I mean, in other words, it probably wouldn't take a lot of preparation for them to do it. And that would be a way of spreading talent. One of the things that I'm putting together, now I don't think for a moment that the league is going to go this way, because they have a big not invented here characteristic. If the board didn't think of it, it must not be good. But I'll pound my division director over the head enough so he'll present it at least, is that to make a bigger commitment to clubs. What if you're an Rsgb club or affiliated club, or you're an ARL affiliated club, what do you get from the league for it? Have a ARL faculty where you've got 15 people. Give them something. Give them free books. Give them a round of applause or notoriety, something that will acknowledge their work. And then, depending upon how many members in your club or league members, then you get so many of these free programs. And you share the wealth. I mean, so if you've got 100% of your members, say you get 6 programs a year, and you get to book these people, and they have 15 of them, and I'm just making 15 up, but you've got some number of people who have this expertise that's sought after. And it might be somebody with a company. Hey, what really happened to develop the FT101 DX? I mean, what's the argument behind that? Or Gerald Youngblood of Flex Radio. I get him to talk to our club. You know why? He's from here, and he comes back here for Thanksgiving, and he wasn't telling anybody, but I know somebody that knows his relatives, so I get him to come talk to our club. His Maestro device for the Flex 6000 series, little portable LCD screen, the first time it was ever showed outside the faculty was at my club. Well, that was just luck. Well, that was in person, but in principle, you can do a lot of the same things, and it will be really good if the National Society took the lead, because they've got the wherewithal to get these people to do it. Just a thought. Now, it starts by clubs, in my opinion, pounding the table and saying, why don't you do this? You should do it. And I will tell you how you can play Don and George off. I know in the United States, CQ Magazine places a lot of heat on QST. And so I talked to Rich Mostenson. I pitched the survey idea to him first. They just couldn't afford it before I pitched it to ARL. The point is, they need to respect business. And sometimes you have to approach it in a business-like way to get them to move. I'm not talking about being ugly. I'm talking about just being good business people. So I'm delighted that you're taking the lead at what you're doing with Zoom, because I think you are a template for other clubs, not just in the UK, but around the world. So my hat's off to you.
Right, Frank, on that point, just today, I had a long conversation with the general manager of the Rsgb and their communications manager, saying to them that I felt that the Rsgb should be doing what we're doing as a club, that they should be organising events like that. They've got the clout to get some of these fantastic big name people, and there would be enormous interest in it. And I mean, they looked at our program. We've got speakers. We had a speaker last week on amateur television. We've got a speaker coming up on using amateur satellites. We've got a speaker coming up on EME and the International Space Station. You know, we're trying to explore the diversity of the hobby, because it's such an enormous hobby, and we are certain that someone is going to get a spark from that that's going to take them off in that direction or give them a new lease of life. But I absolutely agree with you, Frank, that, you know, what we want to be selling this to our national society, because we want to say to them, look, you know, yeah, you've always held your HF convention once a year in a hotel over a couple of days. I'm sure the people that go there really enjoy it. But actually outside, there are thousands of amateurs.
And so many who can't go.
Yeah, exactly.
In the States, so many can't go to Dayton. I went to Dayton last year for the first time ever. And you're spot on. And if it won't mean anything, but tell them one of your speakers from across the pond who's a dues paying member said, bravo, because they should be leading in doing that. And see, not every club can be like the Dayton, Ohio Amateur Radio Club that puts on Hamvention. Do you know they have enough members that their monthly door prize for a meeting is usually one of the leading transceivers? I mean, so unless you're a club like that, where you've got tremendous expertise, thinking about having a club who's got a member who can give a talk on EME, who can give one on TV. Most clubs don't have that. They're lucky if they've got one who's really, you know, and so what you're doing is leveraging what's out there with the technology and being conservative, like long-standing organizations tend to be, ARL and Rsgb. They tend to be slow to move. They get moved when there's a book called Who Moved My Cheese? It's about management. Their cheese is members. Move their cheese like you're doing. You're lobbying them. You're pulling on their shirt tail, and you're now then showing them how to do it. And take me as I'm flattered you asked me, but take me as a person out of it. You just look at all the people that you've got coming in and the expertise. That's proof in and of itself. And I will tell you, I've been doing a little of what you're doing for several years by Skype, and I might get 2 or 3 Skype presentations. Rob Sherwood, Gordon West, Bob Heil. I've had a number of them like that, where you couldn't get that. You generally wouldn't have that expertise in your club. But this is model. Now, you know, the ICQ podcast, we have a position where we don't take advertising. And we've been offered, we had a major manufacturer after I did an interview with one of their leading spokespeople at Hamvention last year, just made an offer. I'll put money in your podcast. And I said, well, I'm flattered. Anybody would be. But we just right now don't do that. We take donations from our listeners. I said, all we want is your time, not your money at this point. Well, think about the Rsgb. They could help fund that a little bit, and maybe they would give an incentive to some of the name people for their time if ICOM helped sponsor that program. And at the end of the beginning of the broadcast, there was a 20-second spot. I mean, it is what it is, you know. You don't run a car without buying petrol. So not that I'm saying you should do that, but if that's a leverage point for them, then so be it. And I think you've got a great template. And, you know, it's one of those positive outcomes of a very negative episode in history. No, we wouldn't have stopped everything to do this. You couldn't put a gun to somebody's head and got everybody to do this. But it's one of those fortunate outcomes. That's why I talked about futuring. There are many futures, and you're helping to create one.
Yeah,
so
thank you,
any
Frank.
way I can help you, I will be happy to.
Oh, that's absolutely brilliant. I mean, I'd just like to say on behalf of our club, you know, thank you for joining us tonight. It was a really, really thoughtful contribution, and, you know, I'm buzzing with ideas from it, and I can see on the screen, just looking at people, that other people listening are exactly the same. So I'd like to thank you very much. I mean, I smiled, by the way, because Frank, when you said that in the Dayton Club, their door prize is a top of the range radio on their raffle prize for club members. In ours, it's Gerald's bottles of wine from France. And Gerald goes across to France and brings back some bottles of wine. And the lucky winner wins the bottle of wine.
Well, and see, this is the top of the glass for most clubs. You're very, very much an exception. So I think more power to you. I will send you my notes to the extent that they're important. Any comments that you think I should see or would benefit from. Sure. And I want you to know that just when I taught classes, I would always end the semester by telling students, look, I probably learned more from you than you did from me. And that's not a put down of you, but how you respond to ideas helps me think about, hey, maybe I didn't think of that before, or maybe I didn't pitch that the right way or whatever. So it's a mutual thing, and I've greatly benefited. And as I said, anytime you can't get a good speaker, give me a jingle. I'll see if I can't talk about something.
All right, thank you very much, Frank. Gerald, do you want to have a final word on this?
Only just to say thank you to all the other people who've joined us, the guests there. If Ray particularly and David M0GHZ, if they want to get some of their local club members to come along and join us one Wednesday evening as well, and see if they like it as well, you might get a group going over at your side the same way. And the rest of you guys, thanks very much for coming as well. And thanks again, Frank. A brilliant show. Next time I'm in the States, I'll have to try to head down to your part of America. But my cousin lives in New Jersey, and my son lives and works in San Francisco, so they're a bit far away from your end.
I understand. Well, if you decide to go to Hamvention, certainly let me know you're coming. I'd love to share a glass with you and visit.
Sounds a good idea. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nick.
Okay. Well, look, thank you very much, everybody. Thanks again, Frank. And we'll meet again, as they say, next week's meeting. We've got Eric 4Z1UG, and I know there's quite a few people interested in his contribution as well. So,
will you tell Eric I said hello and keep up the great work.
Okay, Richard, did you want to have a final word?
Go ahead.
All I was going to say, Frank, it was interesting when you talked about newcomers to the hobby say they couldn't afford a decent radio. And one thing we always say to them, we've talked about getting them from a handheld onto HF, and they've always said it's far too expensive. And all you have to say to them, let me have a look at your cell phone. And they pull out of the pocket $1,000 cell phone. You could buy a decent HF rig second-hand for probably a quarter of that. But I think that's how society looks at the hobby.
Well, and I will tell you, just because I've had a sneak peek, Hans Sommer's QSX rig, the sideband rig, it's got it at $150 as his price point. It will be a very quality rig. So that would be an option, for someone. And I agree with you. It's when you look around and see what's spent otherwise, my wife used to do financial counseling as a personal finance economist. And she said, your money reflects your values. And so when she wrote every day with a pen, I gave her a Mont Blanc and spent way too much money for my taste. But hey, she made her living with a pen, and that's what she used, at every day. So you make your choices, but your point is spot on and very well taken. Thank you for that.
Thank you, and thank you again, being brilliant.
Thank you.
Okay, right. Well, on that note, we'll close the meeting. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day, Frank. And
thank you.
See all the rest of you guys next week.
Have a great guys.
Yeah, good night.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much indeed to you as well, Nick. It's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Richard. Okay, see you all next week. Cheers.
Well, cheers.
Yeah, cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
73 from G0 EVA, off and clear.
Yeah, 73's David.
Bye, David.